Back to the Leadership Lab. I'm Evan McGugan, former naval officer with over a decade of leadership experience in special operations. I'm a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, and I hold an MBA and a master's in psychology of leadership from Penn State. Today, I advise executives, athletes, coaches, and working professionals on how to lead and influence effectively. This podcast is where I take that mix of academic research, pressure tested experience, and translate it into practical lessons for you to lead, motivate, and win. Let's get into today's topic. Scroll through LinkedIn, YouTube, or sit through enough corporate offsites, you'll eventually hear a common set of metaphors. Run your team like a sports team, hire A players, coach, don't manage. Those all sound good. They feel inspiring. But the truth is, if your leadership style is actually to run your workplace like a sports team, you're going to fail. And this is coming from a guy who played Division I lacrosse at the Naval Academy. And there are leadership lessons that I still pull from my days as an athlete. But the dynamics that make a sports team successful are the same ones that can actually destroy your leadership performance, particularly in complex organizations that define the modern workplace. This episode is about that puzzle, why the most celebrated model of teamwork fails under modern workplace conditions and what leaders can learn from it anyways. By the end of this episode, you'll know how to build systems that combine the discipline of sports with the adaptability of cognitive leadership, and how to lead teams that perform under pressure without turning your culture into a locker room. Main reason sports metaphors dominate the leadership content that you'll see and hear is because it's simple. Sports are visible, measurable, dramatic, and they're visceral. Sports are designed in such a way that they give us instant clarity because the rules are stable. There's a scoreboard, there's a winner, there's a loser, and there's a clock that expires. You can see the effort, you can see progress, and you can measure it. Winning and losing is binary, and every play is filmed, analyzed, and corrected in a predictable cycle of seasons and off seasons. The stability and clarity that you see in sports is intoxicating to leaders and managers who feel like they're drowning in ambiguity. We look at that structure and we think, if I could just bring that clarity to my team and that alignment into my team, everything would run smoother. And so we import the language. We talk about coaching, we talk about locker room culture, players who can execute. We create slogans about grit and about hustle and high performance. And for a time, a day, a few weeks, a month, maybe even a few months, the energy goes up, the language feels aligned, but then something breaks again. Morale dips, the coordination fails, people burn out, we see creativity slow to a crawl because we copied the metaphor, but not the mechanics and the principle behind it. We didn't extract the principle and apply it to our own parameters. We simply copied the tactic and expected it to fit in a different context. The difference isn't just a motivational one, although sometimes that's part of the problem. It's context and it's cognition that's the problem. The sports teams that we pull metaphors from operate in an environment of known variables and bounded time. The size of the field never changes. The rules are written, the rules are enforced, and they're visible. The competitors are known, they're measurable, and they're trained in the same skill domain. And the game starts and ends on a predictable schedule, and the clock defines our state of urgency. Players train for predictable constraints. They study film, they anticipate patterns, they anticipate strategies, and they build muscle memory in an unstable environment. And that's what makes practice in a sports world effective. It's repetition under known conditions for a predetermined outcome. Workplace teams operate in environments that are constantly ambiguous and are on infinite timescales. The field changes daily. You have shifting or new markets, new and evolving technology, and shifting or competing priorities, sometimes by the day. The rules and ethics are often unclear and they're often political in nature. The opponents might be competitors one day and partners the next. And there's no clock, just a constant rolling deadline of new tasks. You can't just practice the play until you get it right. You have to adapt your system over time. And that's why importing the entire sports mindset into leadership for the modern workplace doesn't work because your environment is ambiguous and unbounded in its nature. When you copy a model that's designed for short bursts of predictable, cyclical, and high intensity competition and apply it to a long term cognitively complex work environment, you're going to fall short as a modern leader. That's the real problem with the sports analogy. It oversimplifies the complexity and fails to adapt it to the context. 2001 research, Nancy Kotz and George Koenig published a paper in the Academy of Management Executive called Sports Teams as a Model for Workplace Teams, Lessons and Liabilities. They pointed out that while sports and businesses share the same surface language, competition, teamwork, and performance, they operate on different psychological architectures. And this article is the inspiration for today's episode. They articulate that sports teams succeed because of four conditions that rarely exist in the modern workplace. One is uniform skill domain. Everyone on the field trains in the same physical language. Short time horizons. So games are measured in minutes, seasons in months, and then the cycle predictably repeats itself. There are clear metrics. So the scoreboard never lies. And there's a shared physical presence. Communication is immediate, it's embodied. People see the same players and teammates every day in, day out, doing the same things. Now compare that to your modern workplace. Different disciplines all trying to synchronize various timelines, sometimes long, sometimes short, in goals of various ambiguity. Sometimes they're very clear, sometimes they're very unclear. And communication is varying degrees of distributed, digital, and asynchronous. That's why motivational speeches modeled after sports in general or the wrong sport in particular typically don't work in the modern workplace as well as we are told. They're built for a completely different nervous system and cognitive mode. People seem to love them anyways, and that's why we're talking about them today. When you push constant competition like you do in a sports team, you erode the collaboration that the modern workplace needs. And when you push constant collaboration, which the modern workplace tends to do, you miss out on all the developmental benefits of inter team competition. And then when you glorify your star players, you create dependence instead of development. This is where most corporations and leadership experts on LinkedIn guide their leaders to fail using sports metaphors. They borrow the sports intensities and the sports mantras, but they ignore the sports precision and the specificity applied to their context in the workplace. Copying sports models fails. What should we borrow instead? Well, there are 7 lessons that we can take from this article on what we can borrow from sports models for leadership. The first lesson involves one of the most fundamental challenges every leader has with motivating a team. That's why leaders can, in fact, borrow the principle of integrating competition and collaboration amongst team members in the workplace. This means finding the right tension between teammates who help each other and who are invested in each other's success, but also push one another to perform at their best by striving to outdo one another. If you have high cooperation but low competition, you end up with highly cohesive teams, but without individuals who are driven to peak performance. If you have high competition and low cooperation, you get really high performing individuals who end up working at cross purposes. If competition and cooperation are both low, then you get unmotivated and uncoordinated individuals. However, if you get cooperation and competition high, your team is going to be full of highly energized individuals who are working together effectively at peak performance. There's substantial research and discussion on the benefits of promoting cooperation amongst teammates. There's relatively little research and public discussion on promoting constructive competition within a team in the modern workplace. And often, competition within a team in the modern workplace is highly discouraged. What advocates of cooperation only strategies in the modern workplace don't admit is eliminating competition is neither realistic nor is it healthy. The team's going to lose out on potential benefits of competition. So the drive, the spark, and the energy to keep improving. And the impulse to compete is driven underground and repressed. And it tends to be expressed covertly in unhealthy ways that don't benefit the team or even undermine the team. When you acknowledge competition, you structure it intelligently, and you treat it as a positive thing, you create a competitive drive from your people that takes a much healthier form. And you end up with people who want to outperform one another without undermining each other. If you look at sports and the teams that foster competition have, on average, a much higher win loss record. but the competition has to benefit the team, not the individual. So leaders and managers can borrow this principle of competition and cooperation by shaping the how, the when, and around what team members are going to compete over. In sports, whether teams' first efforts meet success or meet failure can profoundly influence the team's future. Which brings me to my second lesson: orchestrate wins early. Early events shape the path a team's going to follow. Across sports, the team or the individual who scores first is profoundly more likely to win. You see this in sports like hockey and individual sports like wrestling. Now, you could argue that this indicates that the person who scored first is more talented and for that reason will win. But this finding in the research holds true across championship level competition where talent and skill are largely equal. This because it creates a self fulfilling spiral. Now, when athletes get on a good track record quickly, they tend to perform even better as time goes on, while those who don't because their problems compound. This is because it triggers psychology that makes those who get early wins aspire to more and expect more out of themselves compared to those who don't. Early successes build a team's faith in themselves and their capacity as a team. Corollary here for leaders and managers is that a team that gets off to a strong start will elicit a much different response from its environment. It's going to attract greater resources, more information, higher quality feedback, and better assignments than teams that get off to a worse start. People outside the team will expect more from it and give it more opportunities. Therefore, the challenge for leaders is to set an upward spiral in action. This requires getting some early wins under their belt. Leaders and managers can't guarantee success, but they can increase the odds that their team's early efforts will succeed. And a simple strategy to do this is to carve out the team's larger tasks into short term, manageable, smaller ones that are relatively straightforward, simple, and where success is concrete and unambiguous. And then call attention to those wins. This is how you jumpstart an upward spiral in a team. Downward spirals are particularly pernicious in sports and in life and in work because they are easy to start and difficult to stop. All it takes is a couple of failures or even perceived failures, which highlights the importance of framing, by the way. People and teams see what looks like or what they perceive as a failure or what actually is a failure, and then predict that failure is more likely to happen again. So, just like an upward spiral, this becomes a self fulfilling prophecy downwards. Even if the team eventually enjoys some small successes, there's a good chance that the team will ignore or even misinterpret the feedback because the information is inconsistent with what they've been expecting. And on top of that, once people see that the team is failing, the team is less likely to get the resources and feedback that it needs to succeed, like a winning team usually does. The obvious path is to avoid downward spirals altogether by creating upward ones, but even teams with sufficient talent can still find themselves slipping into a downward spiral. That's typically from poor leadership, but not always. And this is an area where leaders can learn a lot from sports. Breaking a downward spiral is all about the reframe. There are two common features that characterize failing individuals or failing teams from a psychological perspective. They're much more likely to attribute their problems to causes that are stable and uncontrollable. This means that the team or person who is in a downward spiral identifies that the cause of their failure is something that is one, unlikely to change, and two, beyond their capacity to influence. This obviously leads to demoralization and a sense of helplessness. A good reframe during a downward spiral shifts the perspective to one that is unstable and controllable. So, a leader has to give everyone who's failing the feeling that their fate could change and that they could make change happen. So, reframing opens up a whole new set of options. Fundamental structure of competitive sports is that games alternate with practices. Each represents two different modes of team functioning. During games or matches, teams are in performance mode. These are perceived as do or die settings where teams or individuals must flawlessly execute well trained plays and tactical schemes. Now, during practice, teams are in learning mode. It's an opportunity for refinement in experimentation and innovation. Teams and players in practice can develop and test new plays and make mistakes along the way. In the world of competitive sports, the rhythm of alternating game mode and practice mode is built into the team structure. Workplace teams are often under such immense pressure for results that they are in performance mode all the time. So the need to balance this with the learning mode is often neglected. Therefore, it's a leader's responsibility to deliberately carve out time and space for a learning mode. Leaders want to carve out time and space for a learning mode like a sports team. That means they have to understand what aspects of a sports team's practice make it an ideal setting for learning, and then replicate those conditions to create the equivalent of practice in the workplace. Most significant characteristic of sports practice that's desirable for the modern workplace is to try new things and fail. Experimentation and failure are an integral part of learning. So, organizations that can specialize in learning and innovation are ones who don't just overlook failure, but they systematically promote it. The idea is to fail often so you'll succeed sooner. Managers and leaders should not welcome all failures. They have to welcome only intelligent failures. That means failures that promote learning do not happen by accident. They're a result of conducting small but thoughtfully planned experiments. Sports teams practices exemplify several key conditions that are essential to fostering intelligent failure. One is practice has to be stable, it has to be low risk, it has to be low arousal, and it has to be done in a familiar environment. A leader can take these principles and deliberately carve out time in space where a team can experiment with some of its usual procedures, such as a presentation strategy or a mandatory 1 day back in the office where debriefs can happen. All those are done in a familiar environment that is low risk, low arousal. In sports teams where teams play against the clock, a basic feature of the game is the halftime break. And even in sports where there are periods, there's usually some small amount of downtime between them for regrouping and strategy, even if only momentary, such as in wrestling. This is a critical piece of the game or the match, and something that leaders who are working against a clock, which is probably most, would be wise to emulate in some fashion. By definition, halftime or periods occur at a specific temporal point of a team's work. It's a predictable but special opportunity in a team. Research has shown that teams that face a deadline, that is, teams with a prescribed endpoint, which is most, evolve in predictable ways over time. And one of those ways is that there's a point in time where team members are opening to questioning and revising their task strategies and methods. That point is typically around the chronological midpoint of a team's work. And this finding is consistent in teams with different durations, working at different paces and on different tasks. No matter your industry or how long your work project is, whether it's a day, a week, or a year, there's a midpoint where your team is going to be more open to adjustments. And that midpoint serves as a sort of psychological alarm clock by which teams internally manage their work. And it's a really handy milestone for leaders where team members are more open to gauging how well they are doing and how likely it is that they're going to meet their deadline using the same task strategies and methods that they've been using. If you try any other point other than the midpoint of a project, you're more likely to meet with resistance and meet with much less interest in making adjustments, particularly early on in a project's lifespan, because people want to just dive into the work first. Leaders who want to adjust their team's work methods and strategies while their project is underway need to time their intervention strategies strategically, which may mean waiting for the midpoint. Formally structure halftime assessments into the work of your team and create more opportunity for mini interventions similar to the timeout, and introduce artificial endpoints such as end of quarter results or annual performance reviews. Team needs time to gel together, especially when the work requires a high level of collaboration. So team composition needs to be stable long enough that a team can learn how to work together and how to combine their efforts into a more coherent whole. In sports, the teams with the most stable memberships, especially ones that are over 2 years, are much more likely to win, all other variables being equal. The more time teammates have with one another, the more able they are to anticipate one another's moves, how they move on the field with one another, how they respond, and the clearer they are about one another's roles, which all result in better performance. The shared experience from the time spent with one another in practice and in games is another strategic asset that a coach has, since it's based on knowledge that is unique to the player and to the team, and it's non transferable to another team. The need to give teams time to gel in the modern workplace is just as true as it is on sports teams. In today's high velocity workplace where job switching has become the norm, keeping a team intact for 2 years may be impossible. Even so, there are strategies that leaders and managers can use to increase the stability of its team membership. When building a team, leaders have a variety of options at their disposal to keep the team more stable. But two really simple ones are to only pick people who are free to stay for the duration of the project and to enhance the benefits and minimize the costs of being a member of the team. Sports teams, especially at the elite and professional level, it's standard procedure to watch game tape. In addition to all the other benefits of group performance review, one that stands out for leaders in the modern workplace is an opportunity for professional development and cross functional contextual awareness. Teams who don't take the time to do similar analysis and debriefings in the modern workplace miss out on the opportunity to learn invaluable new things, consider old lessons, and gain a better appreciation of the contributions of other team members that you may not gain awareness of during the regular execution of your daily tasks. Leaders don't make it a ritual to build assessment and debriefings into the rhythm of their work. It's unlikely that it's going to happen on their own. And on top of that, the regularity of these debriefings is essential to maximizing the value of the debriefings themselves or reviewing game tape. When you make a habit of reviewing game tape, the anxiety that people have regarding the feedback in general melts away with each session. And then the more consistent and the more often that you have these game tape review sessions, the faster that that anxiety is going to melt away because it becomes expected. Obvious that sports provide invaluable lessons for leaders in the modern workplace. I played lacrosse at the Naval Academy, and I still pull lessons from my time as an athlete. However, modern leaders need to be aware of the liabilities of drawing on sports metaphors as perfect models for leadership. When we use sports in its leadership lessons inappropriately, the sports comparisons can lead managers and leaders astray pretty quickly. There are caveats that we need to be aware of. First caveat is choosing the right sports team as a model. Sports in general can provide a lot of valuable lessons for life as well as the workplace. But in the workplace, some sports are more relevant and more instructive than others. Leaders and managers need to consider the degree of fit between the team that's being managed and the sports team that's being emulated. Most important dimension of fit when using sports as an inspiration for leadership involves the degree of interdependence among teammates on sports teams that leaders are using as a model. Now, for sake of discussion, we're going to use three fundamental types of sports: baseball, football, and basketball. Baseball has the least amount of interdependence. It's not zero, but success is basically predicated on the level of talent each player has and the coach's ability to build a lineup. Therefore, baseball lessons are most suitable for teams like sales teams where success depends on each person performing at their peak. The dominant value of success in baseball is self reliance and amassing strong individual talent. Football has a moderate amount of independence, and the nature of gameplay is sequential. Players receive strategy, coordination, guidance, and the play top down from their coach and interact in a series. Quarterback hands off the ball, offense yields to the defense. So, an excellent team in football is made up of excellent individuals and team performance. So, the leadership lesson from football fits really well into an assembly line or manufacturing type of team. And so, a leader's most important task on these types of teams is preparing the game plan. It's determining the hierarchy responsible for execution and delegating the appropriate amount of authority to a team member at the top of the hierarchy right underneath the coach, aka the quarterback. Basketball team or a similar sport like hockey, soccer, or lacrosse, which is what I played, has the highest level of interdependence amongst team members. Strategies established prior to the game, but coordination throughout the game is achieved through constant mutual adjustment, most of which happens in real time. All or most of the players on the field or the court or the ice are involved in every play, and there's almost continuous movement by everyone that's on the field, not just the player with the ball. Plays fluid, and the coach's intervention happens on a by exception basis. So an excellent team for these type of sports that have a high degree of interdependence is made up of excellent team players. Lessons from sports like baseball and hockey and soccer and lacrosse and even rugby fit really well into the modern workplace that is often made up of some degree of cross-functional team where there's a continuous involvement and work is repeatedly passed back and forth between individuals. And so the dominant value on these types of teams is cooperation. And so the leader's role on highly dependent teams that tend to make up the modern workplace is that of an integrator who fosters a shared sense of responsibility among all the team members that are involved. Second caveat when using sports metaphors for leadership is to not confuse coaching with managing and coaching with leading. The role of coaching in the modern workplace has some important differences compared to sports. And it's tempting to think otherwise because of how popular it is to view managing and leadership as coaching. I see this all the time from prior athletes on LinkedIn, but a leader who focuses exclusively or even predominantly on pulling lessons from sports coaching is severely limiting team effectiveness and leadership performance in the modern workplace. The quality of coaching in sports, which we can define as the quality of day-to-day interactions with the team and team building activities like practice, can be a huge factor in team success or team failure in sports. However, the design of the task, the design of the game, and the team context vary relatively little from team to team within the same sport. That is not the case in the modern workplace, where those variables can vary greatly from team to team. Leaders have to decide on the design of the task, the design of the team structure, and pursue the acquisition of team resources, whereas coaching does not. As much as all the experts on LinkedIn want to try to convince you that coaching esque activities like day to day interactions and team building activities are what separates effective leaders from not in the modern workplace, the evidence just does not conclusively support that. There's a lot of evidence that shows that getting the structure variables right has a much bigger impact on team performance in the modern workplace than coaching type activities do. I'm not saying coaching shouldn't happen because I think it's an awesome tool for leaders, but make sure it fits the team context and make sure that you get the structure variables right first. And this is coming from a prior athlete. Third caveat to using sports style leadership and metaphors is to make sure that leaders are building bridges, not boundaries. When leaders use sports as a model, they often use metaphors and language to illustrate what they mean. These are meant to serve as examples and inspire the team, and using a specific sport can create a common point of reference for people on the team. But using a metaphor assumes everyone on the team understands that sport well enough to extract the principle from the metaphor. Therefore, sports metaphors risk building boundaries as opposed to the bridges that they were meant to. What I mean by that is, even though taking leadership inspiration from a sports metaphor doesn't intend to exclude members through its language, we have to recognize that it has potential to. Don't assume that everyone on your team is conversant in a sport that you're pulling the metaphor from, let alone the specific sport that the metaphor is built on. If you're going to use a sports metaphor, it'd be wise to explain what the metaphor means fully using an example afterwards, at least the first time you use it. It'll be less likely to perceive as code. Leaders need to be careful when using sports references because they risk sending unintentional messages. In sports, the rules are really clear, and participants include willing members of each team, and winning is the only goal. The outcome is tabulated in wins and losses, but in the modern workplace, business is expansive. The rules are much less clear. They're often ethically and politically motivated, and the stakes are much higher. The goal isn't to just win in the modern workplace, it's to keep playing the game of business in a way that you win enough to thrive, which usually means that you're playing in a way that other people want to play with you. It's the infinite game. When you use sports language, you risk people on your team inferring that the workplace is ethically and morally no more complex than the playing field. And as a prior athlete, I think this is particularly important with your younger members of your team who recently came from a sports background, because that's the only context for leadership that they have. Real value leaders can pull from sports isn't competition. It's not platitudes of teamwork and coaching. It's structure. There are four things that translate perfectly into modern leadership systems from sports. First is clarity of mission. Every player knows the goal, the metrics, and the rules. There's a cadence of execution, so games and practice. There's a performance mode and a practice mode. And leaders have to navigate the tension to keep their team performing and keep their team improving so that they can stay relevant. There's immediate feedback systems and then recalibration. So corrections are constant rather than just annual. And there's shared accountability. Everyone can see everyone else's performance. These aren't systems of motivation, although motivation is important. These are systems of clarity. And when leaders translate those elements into their organizations, you're going to increase the likelihood that your performance stabilizes. There's also liabilities when leaders try to take inspiration from sports. Zero sum thinking is a liability when leaders try to take inspiration from sports. If one team wins, someone else must lose. That's how it works in sports. It's a very simple mindset, and it's a mindset that kills collaboration across departments and organizations with whom you might be partnering with in the future. Hero culture is a liability when leaders try to take inspiration from sports. Dependence on your top performers risks creating a fragile system. Leverage them, but don't necessarily be dependent on them. Short-term metrics are a liability when leaders try to take inspiration from sports, because not every problem can be solved in quarters like it is in sports. Some problems require entire seasons of learning and entire seasons of performance. Coach as commander and the coach as leader approach is a liability when leaders try to take inspiration from sports, because real world leadership requires a high degree of shared cognition, not just one voice determining strategy and shouting instructions, which is what a lot of sports are based off of. So the task when taking inspiration from sports isn't to copy the entire playbook. It's to abstract the principle and make sure that it's the right one that fits your context for your workplace. Sports gives leaders and managers something that we crave. There's visible structure, there's immediate feedback, there's measurable progress, there are clear winners and losers. But modern leadership lives in complexity, not just competition. Leaders in sports who thrive under pressure aren't necessarily the loudest in the locker room, although sometimes they are. They're also the ones who engineer calm and engineer certainty. Modern leaders should take what works from sports, the clarity, the cadence, the feedback, and the accountability systems, and leave behind what breaks: the hero culture, the zero sum thinking, the adrenaline as strategy. Effective leadership in the modern workplace isn't just about hype or charisma or even technical skill, which are the two ways that players can lead on a team. Modern leadership is about both of those things and the cognition to build systems that absorb pressure and hold when things get hard. If you found this useful, subscribe for more episodes on the psychology of leadership and influence and performance. Sign up for my weekly Intel drops, where I send out practical frameworks and useful leadership science every week. Join the Leadership Lab on School. I host live office hours, and join a community of leaders who are serious about their development, where we discuss exclusive lessons and how to build clarity, control, and composure under pressure. You can find all those things in the video description. I'm Evan Guggen. This is the Leadership Lab.